Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the GForce M-Tron Pro IV tutorial. This video is the second in a little mini-series that I've done. In the first video, which I'll put a link to above, we discussed the basic features of the instrument and I gave you a general walkthrough. Today we're going to take a look at the instrument from a more musical perspective. I'm going to use some presets to help demonstrate how you might go about designing sounds in the M-Tron, and hopefully by the end of today you'll be in a better position to both understand the presets that come bundled with it and define your own. Hope you enjoyed the video today. If you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. Awesome way to help support my channel. Okay, the first preset we're going to use today is 6-string keys, and this is the basic sound. Simple C major chord being played there. As we toggle backwards and forwards, you'll see that various options have changed. Let's deal with detune first. This is an enormously common technique in synthesis to generate an interesting sound. The vast majority of modulation effects, chorus, phase, flange, delay itself, they all deal with copies of a sound that are offset in either time and or pitch. And so by having a very small detune offset between the two layers, we're basically just serving to thicken up the sound and make it more interesting. So if we listen to the sound on its own, I'll just play a single note. I'm going to link these two sounds together and move the detune knob to pull them both into tune. And you hear it instantly get kind of flatter, actually just very slightly flatter, because that very tiny difference in pitch, and it is a very subtle difference. The entire detune knob from 12 o'clock all the way up to maximum is only half a semitone. So the two settings, as they were being very slightly offset, just jump away from the preset and come back to it. You can see that one is very slightly sharp and one is very slightly flat. That's just a great takeaway. If you're designing presets, that's a really nice thing to do the vast majority of the time. What else have we got in the tape section that's interesting? Well, attack start seems to be interesting from the perspective of, oh, both of these samples have been very slightly offset, and so they're playing back at a very slightly different kind of location in the sample tape. Well, just be careful not to make too many presumptions, because the reverse button is enabled for layer B and disabled for layer A. So these two layers are actually playing against each other. One's playing forwards, one's playing backwards. So don't get too carried away by seeing a very small offset in the attack start and presuming you know what you're talking about. The reverse button is kind of subverting that idea. So I've soloed layer A, this is going forwards, and solo layer B, and we're going backwards. And both together. Can you also hear that the sounds are panning? Let's have a look at the pan section. Obviously the LFO is dealing with the pan, and when we jump back and forth between layer A and B, all of the pan options look identical. However, you have to bear in mind the two sounds have been panned. Layer B's panned hard right, layer A's panned hard left. Another really nice trick to use when you're deconstructing presets is push a setting to its absolute maximum so that you can really hear it and then dial it back. If we maximize the pan effect, and I'm going to link the two sounds together so that I can just turn the depth knob up and both layers are affected. Now you can hear that sound ping pong backwards and forwards. And now if I set them both central, the pan becomes even more dramatic because both of those sounds are now being panned simultaneously. One of them still playing backwards, but they're being panned simultaneously. And you don't really want it to be that harsh, so it sounds nicer when we go back to the original sound. And now we've got a crossover effect. Very nice sound design. One other thing to look at from this preset, again jump backwards and forwards between A and B, is the difference in aftertouch. Have a look at the aftertouch. Layer A has some filter and layer B doesn't. So when we press into our aftertouch, we're going to hear that. I'm just going to throw the preset away, get back to the basic one, and press a key into the aftertouch. So wherever layer A happens to be, don't forget it's being panned, but it's predominantly in the left ear. getting that extra effect from the aftertouch key. Once again, a really nice thing to do, to just apply these effects to one side of a stereo preset, really accentuate the difference between the two ears. I'm also going to use this preset to have a bit of a play with the filter, because we've got quite an interesting filter envelope on this sound. The envelope's actually identical between the two layers, but I'll link them together anyway, so that all of the edits they do from this point onwards on the filter bank are going to apply to both sounds simultaneously. Firstly, let's deal with the tracking knob. This basically centers us on C3. If I play a C3, see it coming back at 262 Hertz. So this is basically like the middle of a seesaw. Think of it like a filter seesaw. And it doesn't matter what I do with the tracking knob. When I press that particular key, everything will always sound absolutely identical, because that's the center point, the non-moving part of this seesaw. Every other key on the keyboard is going to be affected by the tracking knob in an opposite direction, depending on whether or not it's below or above that key. So I'll play a key, play a C 1 octave lower. Start off with the tracking knob all the way positive. So for notes below the tracking center, positive tracking dulls the tone, negative tracking brightens the tone. So imagine the seesaw, we tilted the seesaw up so that the cutoff for notes below the center point, if I'm pointing at the center point, then all of the notes below that center point are actually having a higher cutoff applied to them. And the opposite effect is obviously going to be true as well. So a note 1 octave above the center point, which is way up here, is duller in the negative tracking and gets brighter as we increase the plus knob. So we're basically just determining the slope of this seesaw, and then every note on the keyboard is going to track with that filter. Now, traditionally, kind of common wisdom will tell you that a positive tracking is usually the way to go. The idea being that as you play higher and higher up the keyboard, you want your most important frequency, your cutoff frequency, to kind of follow along or track with that note. And that's what we're doing. Of course, from a creative perspective, options are always great, so you can't actually invert that logic. But generally speaking, some positive tracking so that you just nudge the cutoff frequency further and further forwards as you go up the keyboard, it generally tends to help make the sound a little bit more natural. And if we jump away from the preset and come back to it, this is normally what you're going to see. You're going to see a positive tracking to accentuate those higher frequencies as you go up the keyboard. Okay, so now let's have a bit more of a chat about the filter envelope. Exactly what is it doing? I'm going to get the cutoff to a point where it's really bright. So I'll turn the cutoff and resonance up to 12 o'clock. So I've got a really bright sound now. And now I'm going to turn every control on the filter down. And it completely stands to reason that the sound would get duller because the envelope's no longer having an effect on the sound. If you think about the envelope as we have this shape, we're going to draw this shape with an attack and a decay and a sustain level. All of that information is being used as a modulator, as a control voltage on the filter cutoff. So everything inside the envelope is affecting the filter cutoff, and it's all positive. It's all basically additional modulation, pushing that cutoff frequency forwards. So with a completely flat envelope, you think, well, we're having no effect on the filter cutoff at all. Here's the thing about the filter in the M-Tron though, the circuit is still live. So even with the filter amount set to 0, the electricity, the circuit has to pass through this filter envelope. And so if I change the sustain level, you are going to hear a tonal change. What I'm basically doing there is I'm setting a new control voltage inside this filter envelope, which is increasing the cutoff frequency of the filter. And with the amount knob set all the way down at the bottom, we're basically having the minimum possible impact on the filter cutoff, but it's non-zero. In fact, you can actually hear the filter envelope still working. If I give us some attack as well, you can actually hear the attack coming up. And there's the attack falling off the shelf, off the cliff, and jumping back down to a 0 sustain level. What this means is that we actually have a really subtle control with the amount of the filter envelope set to 0. You've got a really nice, very subtle filter effect. So you get to decide how long that kind of little mini filter sweep lasts for with your attack and your decay, but don't forget that subtle but important difference between 0 sustain and maximum sustain. So with the controls as they're currently set, the decay has something to do, and you can hear it decaying down to sustain 0. If I turn sustain all the way up, decay kind of doesn't have anything to do anymore. So you're only hearing the attack phase. And at the end of the attack phase, we're already at maximum, so we have nowhere to decay to. Needless to say, as we bring the amount control up now, we're going to have more of a classic filter envelope behavior. And the filter envelope has a much more kind of dramatic impact on the sound now. But I really like the filter envelope amount being set to 0. Just gives me a really nice kind of subtle control. Here's another very useful envelope shape. No attack, a little bit of decay, sustain set somewhere in the middle. Now the filter's having kind of the minimum realistic impact it can have on the sound. It's impossible for it to have no impact on the sound. Those control voltage pops that you're hearing are the sound flowing through the filter circuit. And so by just having a little bit of decay and the sustain set somewhere in the middle, it's a nice flat sound, very usable. All of that philosophy can then be applied to the amplitude envelope as well. So let's try setting a 0 sustain, 0 release, and we'll just use the decay. Very, very sharp. Is that called pizzicato? I'm not great on my classical terms, but we're using the decay level and nothing else to set that sharpness of tone. Now with a 0 attack, you are going to get a little bit of snap. So if you just pull in a tiny bit, I've taken away that pop, that control voltage pop. What we're really doing here is learning how this particular instrument works. Every analog instrument has its own idiosyncrasies, and we're really trying to find out what they are. Okay, done with 6 strings. Let's move on to a new preset. This time I'm going to load sericulturing. Once again, let's toggle backwards and forwards between the layers and let our eye rest on any differences. We've got a very slight difference in the LFO here. Now, layer B has its LFO depth set to 0, so we're not too interested in that one. What's going on layer A though? I like controls set to small values. They usually tell interesting stories. So I'm going to press a note. Okay, right. So that's what the LFO on layer A is doing. It's modulating the pitch. It's basically a vibrato, very slow vibrato. But at 0.1, you can actually click in these values and type it manually. It's extremely subtle, but there. You can just hear. It's like an old tape. It's emulating, well, it's a little bit like the Wow and Flutter. It's doing a similar kind of thing, but it's far more stable. We're actually getting a genuine vibrato here. So this is an alternative to using the Wow and Flutter that we looked at in the previous episode. Really nice way to get some stable vibrato. Now, stable is probably a good term to use for layer A because it is actually providing kind of a bedrock of sound. If we solo layer B, it has a really dramatic filter sweep. So the filter envelope for layer B, toggle backwards and forwards, no filter envelope for A, lots of filter envelope for B. This is where we're getting our big filter sweep from. While we're looking at layer B, actually, I'll just have a quick mention of the word looped. If I hold a key down, you know we've got this 8-second limit on the M-Tron. That's basically as long as the tape can play. Well, I'm holding the key down for more than 8 seconds here and you're carrying on hearing the sound. This sound is an emulation of the Roland VP 330 vocoder. It was a vocoder and string instrument, two quite unusual instruments to find together, and it was produced between 1979 and 1980. This is a sample of that synthesizer. That synthesizer was an analog subtractive synthesizer, so it was capable of generating infinite sounds. So even though the M-Tron is fundamentally based on the Mellotron, and that's where the majority of the attention in this instrument lies, it's worth bearing in mind that certain instruments, if they were capable of generating looped sounds, you'll get looped sounds as well. I might as well mention, just for the sake of completeness, I'm not actually going to load one of them up, but there are some presets that were originally Mellotron, that were restricted to 8 seconds, that have been resampled or remastered into infinite mode. So as you can see here, there's a choir sound that should be only 8 seconds long, but has actually been extended to make it infinite. So you've got the option to either do the authentic thing exactly as it came out of the Mellotron, or have a looped everlasting version of it. Just throwing the preset away there and come back to it. So I want to talk to you about the ensemble effect now. So ensemble basically generates multiple voices for the sound. So you get, in this particular case, 8 different instances of the sound being played back, very slightly spread across the stereo field. So it really, really thickens the sound up. Here's the sound out of the box with the ensemble. And now if I disable ensemble, much, much thinner. Now this is a type 1 ensemble. There are 2 different options to go at. And oddly, whichever one is highlighted is the active button, which means that if you press 2, you'll switch over to a type 2 ensemble. This is currently set to type 1. If we jump over to type 2, the number 8 disappears, and now you have a tone control instead. And this produces a more intense effect. If we turn it on, you'll hear kind of a flanging effect. And that's because all of those different voices are very slightly offset against each other. A flanger introduces pitch modulation into a delayed sound, and this is kind of in the ballpark of that sound, and we're getting a pseudo kind of flanging effect. So type 1 for subtle, type 2 for dramatic is the TLDR. One final thing I'll use this preset to demonstrate, because it's as convenient as any. Layer B has all of this dramatic envelope action going on. Layer A has a much more uninteresting filter envelope. If we want to copy all of these settings across to layer A, you can do the entire parameter bank without actually affecting the underlying patches. I'm going to press the Shift key on my keyboard and then press copy. And you'll see it says layer B parameters have been copied. If I didn't hold the Shift key down, it says bank and parameters have both been copied, and it's actually reminding you. Just press the Shift key. If you only want to copy the parameters, select layer A, paste, and now we've copied all of the parameters from layer B into layer A. And as you can see, they're identical settings, but we've still got the different sounds. One final preset we're going to have a look at today. It's going to be the reverse piano effects sound. Sounds like this. Just having to make sure that those swells don't break the volume. This is a nice example of the LFO being used for filter modulation. So you can see the LFO is set in filter mode. We jump across between layers A and B. They've both got the same settings. So I'll link them together so that we can deal with them simultaneously. Let's hear what effect the LFO is having on the sound. So we're basically applying modulation to the filter cutoff using a sawtooth shape, and you're getting these kind of tonal ramps being introduced. Now if I turn the depth all the way down, I'll just play a key flat. So we're getting no tonal sweep anymore, but we are getting a volume sweep. So let's try to find out where that's coming from. Well, the first place you would look is the amplitude envelope, but it's actually set quite low. We're still linked together here, so we're operating on both layers. I'll pull that down. That's not having an effect on the sound. and we're still getting the volume sweep. The next place to look is the tape section, because Many percussive starting sounds fade away over time, and sure enough, the reverse button is lit. If I turn reverse off, now we have a more stable sound. Next thing to note is that if I press that note multiple times, where's the sound gone? That's a function down at the bottom right hand corner called rewind. This button here, when that's engaged, it basically emulates, imagine kind of this sample being played over time. In the case of the Mellotron, it's the tape being stretched over the playhead. The rewind button emulates basically pulling the sample back to its default position, and it takes 2 seconds to get there. So when the rewind button is engaged, if you play this note too quickly and it hasn't fully rewound, it'll carry on playing from wherever it has rewound to. And so we pretty much got to the end of the sample, and so there was nothing left to play. If I disengage the rewind button, now it'll let me re-trigger that note multiple times. And that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel as well if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.